4 centuries ago, the Womack story crossed an ocean and took root in the New World. By the 17th century, the name appears in colonial Virginia. From there, generation after generation cleared land, raised families, built homes, and followed the American frontier west. But the trail they left behind is difficult to follow. Records are scattered. The same first names appear again and again. Middle names are rare, and for many, almost nothing remains to tell us what they look like or who they were. For generations, their story has survived in fragments. A name on a stone, a line in a will, a military record, a piece of land, and memories pass from one generation to the next. Until now, through archival research, historical records, family photographs, and the faces of living descendants, artificial intelligence allows us to reconstruct a world the surviving paper trail can only describe. Not photographs of the past. These are carefully reconstructed interpretations of people and places behind each name. From colonial Virginia, through Revolution and Civil War, across mountains, rivers, and frontier roads, and into the lives of the descendants today. The scattered pieces begin to form something larger, a family story stretching across centuries. This is a new kind of family documentary. Built from records, reconstructed through technology, and carried forward by the people who inherited the name. We are the Womacks, 4 centuries in the New World. For generations, the Womack family has carried a story about how their life in America began. The story begins in England, in a family closely connected to the church. But according to family tradition, somewhere along the way came a break, a disagreement over religion, a fracture within the family, and ultimately disinheritance. And then America. Whether every detail survived 4 centuries of retelling exactly as it happened, we may never know. But the religious element of the story is fascinating. 17th century England was a place where religion was not simply a matter of private belief. Church, family, politics, inheritance, and social standing were deeply intertwined. Religious disagreement could have consequences far beyond where a person worshipped. So the possibility that a religious dispute contributed to a Womack leaving England for Virginia is not an unreasonable one. In fact, it gives us a compelling possibility for what may have been happening behind the family story. That the Womack journey to America wasn't simply a search for land or opportunity. It may have begun in a disagreement about faith and about willingness to leave an old life behind because of it. What we haven't found is the document that closes the case. No surviving record we've uncovered says this is why we left England. And after nearly 400 years, perhaps none ever will. But then something changes. The Womacks begin appearing in the surviving records of colonial Virginia. William Womack, Abraham Womack, land, court proceedings, estates, families. South of the James River, in the Bermuda Hundred, north of Swift Creek. Everything we've found shows that the Womacks prospered in Henrico County, Virginia. it wasn't just the Womacks either. America itself was thriving. They had crossed an ocean to begin again, but was an ocean enough to escape what they had left behind in England? By the 18th century, the old question of authority, allegiance, liberty, and conscience were rising again, this time in the colonies themselves. What began as a resistance to British rule grew into something far greater. In 1775, revolution broke out. And when the colonies were forced to choose between crown and independence, the Womacks would have to choose too. They made that choice very clear. William Womack the father pledged his allegiance to the new American cause. His sons and relatives entered military service. Across one generation, the descendants of a family whose traditions say they crossed the Atlantic after conflict in England were now willing to fight against British rule to determine what their life in America would become. The fight for independence had become a family affair. For a family whose story began leaving England behind, another generation was now helping decide whether America would remain English at all. Across America, resistance spread, protests erupt. Colonists challenged not simply the tax itself, but whether a parliament an ocean away had the right to impose it upon them without representation. The Stamp Act would eventually be repealed, but the argument behind it wasn't going away. Who had the right to govern the colonies? Over the next decade, protests become resistance. Resistance becomes rebellion, and eventually, rebellion becomes revolution. When war finally came, the Womacks would no longer be watching the struggle between Britain and her colonies from the sidelines. This time, the Womacks weren't leaving. They were staying, and they were fighting. Across the colonies, ordinary men had taken up arms against one of the most powerful empires in the world. The war had tested them through defeat, hunger, bitter winters, and years of uncertainty. On Christmas night, 1776, George Washington led his army across the icy Delaware River, gambling the future of the Revolution on what would become the defining moment in the fight for independence. The nation the Womacks had chose to fight for did not exist yet. They were fighting to create it. Their sons had come of age during the birth of a nation, and when that nation called, 5 sons answered. When the war finally ended, William and his family had reason to be proud. But independence didn't mean the Womacks were finished fighting. William's oldest son, also named William, went on to raise a family of his own. And less than a generation after their father and uncles had fought to create the United States, 2 of his sons would be called upon to defend it. This time they wouldn't go separately. They would go together. In 1812, another generation of Womack went to war. Brothers serving side by side as Americans once again went to war with Great Britain. Their father had fought for American independence. These brothers would fight to preserve it. When you think about the birth of Kentucky, I bet you don't think about the Womacks. But what if I told you they were there? Kentucky was not entirely unfamiliar territory to this family. Generations earlier, Mary Womack had married John Williams. Their son, John Williams Jr., would become an important figure in the early American story. And through the Williams family, the Womack history would intersect with another name inseparable from the Kentucky frontier, Daniel Boone. Boone and the Williams family were connected during the exploration and settlement of Kentucky, part of the movement that carried Virginia families through the mountains and into the western frontier. So when later generations of Womacks began moving towards Kentucky, they weren't entering a place entirely disconnected from their family's past. Kentucky had already touched the Womack story. Their journey would carry them into northeastern Kentucky along the waters of the Little Sandy River and eventually to Pactolus. And then the Womack story itself crossed into Kentucky. Among the family members who made the journey west was Tignall Womack. He left behind the family's generations-old roots in Virginia and carried the Womack's name across the mountains into northeastern Kentucky. There along the Little Sandy River, Tignall and his family began establishing a new home. The land was rugged, but this is where the Womacks would put down roots. Roots deep enough that more than 2 centuries later, traces of that first Kentucky chapter can still be found on the land. Homes would rise here. Children and grandchildren would grow up here. Generations would leave, and generations would return. He had come to Kentucky looking for a new home. He found one that his family would still be calling home generations later. He and his wife raised a large family, and one by one their children began families of their own. The Womack name spread through the valleys and hills surrounding the Little Sandy. They farmed the land, they married into neighboring families, they bought and sold property, built homes, and became part of the communities growing around them. What had begun generations earlier with a family crossing an ocean had become something very different. The Womacks weren't searching for home anymore, they were building one. On a piece of that original Womack landscape, the marker still carries Tignall's name. But the world growing around them was changing too, and before long, another war would reach them, these quiet hills of eastern Kentucky.
William Archer Womack was actually born here in Greenup County. His father was Archer Tignall Womack and Miriam Coons, and they actually lived about 2 miles south of Greenupsburg. Now it's called Greenup. And it was on or near the Little Sandy River. So later on, they farmed while he was growing, and then at about the age of 22, he actually went to Greenupsburg and worked in a mercantile store, and there he met his soon-to-be wife, Anne E. Lyons. So 2 years later, they ended up marrying, and then they actually moved to what is now called Three Prong. And I feel sure that it was also Three Prong back then. It was along the Tigard Creek in the western end of the county. There was a census that was actually taken in 1860 that shows that William Archer and Elizabeth, as well as their children, were actually still there at Three Prong. After the 1860 census, the Civil War broke out. Now, Kentucky was supposed to be a neutral state, but it didn't seem like it worked out that way because the Union had come down at least into this area, and particularly Greenup County, and several of the men that resided here in the county signed up and pledged allegiance to the Union. There was a small contingency of men here that were Southern sympathizers. William Archer Womack was one of them. So they got together, and in particularly on the night of September the 19th, 1861, a group of about 25 men got together, and they decided that they were going to go to Grayson, where there were armaments there, and then they were going to seize them and take them on to Prestonsburg, which the Confederacy had at least a camp there. So the men struck out heading towards Grayson. Now, it's interesting that several of the local people here in Greenup County saw that, so they sent word to Carter County, to their home guard, which seemed like it was kind of like a militia for the safety of the locals in the area. So word was sent on to the Carter County militia, and in turn, word was sent over to Lewis County, to their home guard, and so they struck out and to come to Grayson. Now, I do have a personal comment about this. In the informational age that we currently have, I am really surprised at how quickly that this information was spread from Greenup County to Carter County and to Lewis County to the west. It just shows that, it had to be on horseback, and how fast that information could spread about what was happening. So the contingency of about 25 men went on to Lansdowne Hall, which was located at or near Grayson. And it was a home of the Colonel Andrew Jackson Lansdowne. So he was also a Southern sympathizer. And so they were apparently meeting and having food and drink there when the Carter County and the Lewis County Home Guard surrounded the house, and then there was a shootout.
Gentlemen, the reports are clear. We must act tonight. Sir, the men are weary.
So there were some people that ended up, I think, being killed. Some escaped, and then others were actually captured. One of them was William Archer Womack from Greenup County. So he was captured and then ultimately sent to Camp Chase, which was located in and around Columbus, Ohio. And he was there for quite some time, at least until January the 13th, 1863. William Archer had to sign for the release was similar to what other people who were arrested that evening, what they had to sign. And if you don't mind, I'd like to read the last lines of this. This oath is taken and pass accepted with the full understanding that if the party receiving it be found hereafter in arms against the government of the United States or aiding or abetting its enemies, the penalty will be death. William Archer built the home that we're currently in, and he also had a log cabin that was a store that was built in and around the Old Town Creek, which is about 500 yards from here. So he continued to also build a tannery and a grist mill there along the creek. Afterwards, Colonel Stark helped build a larger store with William Archer and his brother-in-law Billy. And so they kept this, William Archer worked in the store as well as his two sons, Ward and Walter Orne, my great-grandfather. So the store continued to flourish. It also held a post office, and Walter Orne was the first postmaster there, as well as my grandfather, Walter Glenn Womack, and then later on, the post office was then transferred to my mother, Joan Womack Easterling. William Archer actually died here and was buried on the hill overlooking where the store was sitting, and here in Old Town, and his grave can be found there today, as well as Anne Elizabeth, his wife, is also buried at that cemetery.
The Civil War divided Kentucky, and in many families the division reached all the way to the dinner table. Archer Womack was born in Carter County, Kentucky, and raised in a family whose roots were already planted deep in the hills of eastern Kentucky. But when war came, Archer's path carried him south. The Revolution had called generations of Womacks to fight for the same cause. The Civil War would ask them to choose sides, and even brothers would not always make the same choice. At 24 years old, the Kentucky farmer enlisted in Louisiana, joining Company G of the 15th Louisiana Infantry in the Confederate service. The Civil War did not simply divide North from South. In the Womack family, it divided brothers. While Archer Womack would eventually wear Confederate gray, his brother Egbert Womack chose the Union. Egbert enlisted at Paintsville, Kentucky in the fall of 1861. One Womack brother had gone to war beneath the United States flag. Another was fighting beneath the Confederate flag. And for Archer Womack, the worst of the war was still ahead. In May of 1863, amid one of the most violent campaigns in the war, Archer was wounded in Chancellorsville. He survived. For months afterwards, military roles carried him away from the regular duty as he recovered. But the wound did not end his service. Archer returned, and 1 year later he found himself in another Virginia forest. At the battle whose name would become painfully appropriate. The Wilderness. On May 6, 1864, Archer was wounded again. This time the damage was permanent. His military record states simply that his arm was resected. A few words on a page describing an injury Archer would carry for the remainder of his life. But Archer Womack's story did not end on the battlefield. Family history remembers that while recovering from his wounds in Virginia, Archer met Patty Hatchett, the woman who would become his wife. The surviving family accounts describe her as a nurse who cared for his wounds, although that part of the story remains family tradition rather than something established by military record. After the war, Archer and Patty married and made their way back to Kentucky. Near Pactolus, Archer exchanged the battlefield for the tobacco field. There he built a home, raised a family, and began again. The war had taken part of Archer's arm. It had wounded him twice, but it did not take his future. He came home and built one. In the end, Archer Womack was remembered not only for what the war took from him, but for what he chose to build afterward.
The first log cabin that they built was on the other side of the river. Well, they didn't like it over there. River gets up, hard to get down, get supplies. Wasn't obviously no bridges or anything like that. And so they came over here on this side. The evidence in the house shows this has been taken down. Now, was it taken down over on the other side and brought here? But the folklore has it being built over on the river bank. Well, you can imagine when water got up in it and they had 10 or 11 kids and tracking that mud on dirt floor, and they moved it over here. But then the evidence that we found was Roman numerals on the rafters in the top up here. So why would you have Roman numerals on them unless you're moving the house? You need to know where they go back, okay? So we think this cabin has, that part in there, has been moved. Now, whether it was moved from the riverbank from flooding, and that's folklore, or whether it's moved from across the river over here, I don't know. Why would you put Roman numerals on rafters? It shows up on the Grayson survey. It has the 150 acres up there they call the Kibbe. That's where my house is. Okay, at Falls Branch. You can see that because you can look at the creeks and you look at the rivers. Okay, so you know where you're at by the creeks and rivers. And then you got this stretched across to my understanding, stretched all the way to that back ridge over there, from this ridge here to that ridge over there, all across here. And when I got this was the only piece that hadn't been out of the family for the whole period of time. There's 72 acres here, or 74, one of the two. We had it surveyed, but this piece right here hadn't been out. All that over there had been sold off, and other pieces have been sold off. Well, I proceeded to start putting stuff back together. So I've got 350 acres of what I believe is of the original 485 acres consolidated back together. A lot of us had girls, and so there's not many, surnames Womack. And then they've all scattered and gone to places where they get better employment and all the things that happen that, that's not here. I mean, it's a great place to live, in my opinion, but it's, the opportunity's not here. It feels real good. They're married well, and all four of them work in the business, so they know how to run the business, and they can run it and run it real well. So I'm real pleased. I hope that my kids and grandkids can take what I've left them and they can excel on it to another extent, another level. That's the goal.
Is there anything that you want to have said after maybe you're not here and your grandkids are like, man, I wonder what Papa was like? What could you say that could be in here that you think would be most meaningful?
Well, that's for another time. I want to do something, okay, but it's not for this.
Not for this.
Not
okay.
for this. I want to do something regarding that to where that they could get to know me and how I got where I got.